Have you ever sat at a dinner table, surrounded by people who thought they were better than you, listening to them tear apart everything about your life, your choices, your appearance, while the person you love just sat there in silence? Have you ever felt so small, so invisible, so utterly worthless that you questioned whether you even deserved to breathe the same air as these people? Well, let me tell you something that happened to me. Something that changed my entire perspective on love, self-worth, and the masks we wear to fit into worlds that were never meant for us. My name doesn't matter right now. What matters is what I went through, what I endured, and how I finally found my voice when I thought I had lost it forever. This is the story of the night I let his family insult me, mock me, belittle me, and treat me like I was nothing more than dirt on the bottom of their expensive shoes. And then I revealed who I really was. And let me tell you, the look on their faces was something I will never, ever forget for as long as I live. It started 6 months before that terrible night, when I met Daniel at a small coffee shop in the city, one of those places that tries to be cozy but ends up feeling cramped and overwhelming during rush hour, where the smell of fresh espresso mingles with the sound of keyboard clicks and hushed conversations about dreams and deadlines. I was there finishing up some work on my laptop, completely absorbed in what I was doing, when suddenly I heard this voice, warm and apologetic, asking if the seat across from me was taken. I looked up, and there he was, Daniel, with his kind brown eyes, his slightly messy dark hair that looked like he had just run his fingers through it, and this genuine smile that made my heart skip in a way I hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't trying too hard. He wasn't putting on a show. He just seemed real, authentic, like someone who actually cared about the world beyond his own reflection. We started talking, and what began as a simple conversation about the terrible Wi-Fi connection turned into hours of discussing everything from our favorite books to our biggest fears, from childhood memories to dreams we barely dared to speak out loud. There was something magnetic about him, something that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in so long, like he was actually listening to my words instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. That first meeting led to a second date, then a third. Then suddenly we were seeing each other almost every day, stealing moments between work obligations and life responsibilities, creating our own little bubble of happiness in a world that often felt too harsh and demanding. Daniel worked in finance, something corporate that I never fully understood despite his patient explanations. But he had this way of making even the most boring topics sound interesting when he talked about them with such passion. He told me about his family briefly, mentioning that they were traditional and a bit old-fashioned, but he always said it with this nervous laugh that I thought was endearing at the time, not realizing it was actually a warning sign I should have paid more attention to. I, on the other hand, was more guarded about my background, not because I was ashamed, but because I had learned the hard way that people treat you differently when they know certain things about you, when they discover that you're not who they assumed you were based on superficial judgments and quick assessments. I told him I worked as a consultant, which was technically true, just not the complete picture, not even close to revealing the full scope of what I actually did or who I actually was in my professional life. During those early months of our relationship, everything felt perfect in that effortless way that makes you believe you've finally found your person, your safe place in a world full of chaos and uncertainty. We would spend lazy Sundays in bed, talking about nothing and everything, making plans for a future that seemed bright and uncomplicated. He would tell me I was beautiful when I woke up with messy hair and no makeup. He would listen to my random thoughts about life and death and meaning with genuine interest. And he would hold my hand in public like he was proud to be with me, like he wasn't afraid to show the world that I was his and he was mine. I fell in love with him slowly and then all at once, in that devastating way where you suddenly realize that this person has become essential to your happiness, that your days feel incomplete without hearing their voice or seeing their smile. I trusted him completely, believed in us with every fiber of my being, and thought that maybe, just maybe, I had finally found someone who would love me for who I truly was, not for what I could offer or what status I could bring to their life. But then came the invitation, the one that would change everything and expose the cracks in our seemingly perfect relationship. It was a Tuesday evening, I remember, because I had just finished a particularly exhausting video call with clients overseas, and Daniel came over to my apartment with takeout from our favorite Thai restaurant, the one with the incredibly spicy green curry that we both loved, despite how it made us sweat. We were eating and laughing about something ridiculous we had seen online when he suddenly got quiet, that kind of quiet that immediately makes your stomach drop because you know something important is coming. He put down his fork, reached across the table to hold my hand, and said, "My family wants to meet you. They're having a dinner this Saturday, and they specifically asked me to bring you." The way he said it, with this mixture of excitement and nervousness, should have been my first real clue that this wasn't going to be a simple family dinner, that there was something he wasn't telling me, some crucial piece of information he was deliberately withholding, because he knew it might change things between us. I should have asked more questions right then and there, should have pressed him for details about his family, about their expectations, about why he seemed so anxious about this meeting, but I was too caught up in the moment, too happy that he wanted me to meet the people who mattered most in his life. I said yes immediately, told him I would love to meet his family, and spent the next few days imagining what it would be like, creating these elaborate scenarios in my head about warm hugs and welcoming smiles and instant connections with his mother and siblings. I pictured casual conversations about shared interests, laughter around a dinner table, maybe his mom showing me embarrassing childhood photos of Daniel while he protested good-naturedly. I was naive, so incredibly naive, because I had no idea what I was actually walking into, no concept of the judgment and cruelty that was waiting for me behind the doors of his family's mansion. The days leading up to Saturday were filled with this nervous excitement that made it hard to focus on anything else. I found myself constantly thinking about what to wear, what to say, how to make the best first impression on people whose opinions suddenly mattered so much because they mattered to Daniel. I went shopping for a new dress, something classy but not too formal, settling on a simple navy blue dress that hit just below my knees, paired with modest heels and minimal jewelry. I wanted to look put together but approachable, sophisticated but not intimidating, striking that impossible balance that women are always expected to achieve in situations where we're being evaluated and judged by people who have already made up their minds about us before we even walk through the door. Daniel had mentioned that his family was well off, but I didn't think much of it because lots of people describe their families that way, and it can mean anything from comfortable middle class to actually wealthy, and I honestly didn't care either way because I wasn't dating him for his money or his family's status. Looking back now, I realize how many red flags I ignored in the days before that dinner, how many signs Daniel gave me that should have prepared me for what was coming but didn't because I was too in love to see them clearly. He kept making these comments about how I should just be myself, but then would immediately follow up with specific instructions about topics to avoid, like, maybe don't mention that you grew up in that neighborhood, or probably better not to talk about your college experience, or let's just say you work in consulting and leave it at that. Each time he said something like this, he would quickly add that his family was judgmental or traditional or set in their ways, using these vague descriptors that somehow made their prejudices seem acceptable, like character quirks rather than serious moral failings. I brushed it off, told myself that every family has their quirks and expectations, convinced myself that it would all be fine once they actually met me and saw that I was a good person who genuinely loved their son. Saturday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that usually makes me happy, the kind where the air smells like fallen leaves and possibilities. But that morning I woke up with this knot in my stomach that I couldn't explain, this sense of foreboding that I tried to shake off as just normal nervousness about meeting important people in Daniel's life. I spent hours getting ready, probably too long, obsessing over every detail of my appearance in a way that wasn't like me at all. I straightened my naturally wavy hair until it fell in a perfect smooth curtain down my back, applied makeup with more care than I usually took, practiced my smile in the mirror like I was preparing for a performance rather than a family dinner. Daniel picked me up at 6, and the moment I got in his car, I could feel his tension, see it in the tight grip of his hands on the steering wheel, hear it in the way his voice was slightly too high when he complimented my dress. The drive to his family's house took about 40 minutes, heading out of the city into one of those suburbs where the houses get progressively larger and the spaces between them get progressively wider, where perfectly manicured lawns stretch out like green carpets and luxury cars sit in circular driveways like sculptures on display. Daniel tried to make small talk during the drive, but I could tell his mind was elsewhere, distracted by worries he wasn't sharing with me, and every time I asked if everything was okay, he would just squeeze my hand and say, "Of course, everything's fine," in that tone people use when everything is definitely not fine but they're not ready to admit it yet. As we turned onto his family's street, I felt my breath catch in my throat, because these weren't just houses, they were estates. Massive properties with gates and gardens and architectural details that screamed old money and established power. When we pulled up to his family's house, I had to actively stop my jaw from dropping, because calling it a house was like calling the ocean a puddle. It was a mansion, a genuine mansion with columns and balconies and what looked like an actual fountain in the front courtyard. "You said your family was well off," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I intended, and Daniel had the decency to look uncomfortable as he parked the car behind a Mercedes that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. "Yeah, I guess I downplayed it a bit," he admitted, not meeting my eyes. And in that moment, I felt the first real flash of anger, the first genuine question about whether I actually knew this man I had fallen so deeply in love with over the past 6 months. Why hadn't he been honest about this? Why had he let me walk into this situation completely unprepared for the level of wealth and privilege I was about to encounter? But before I could say anything else, before I could express my confusion and hurt, he was already out of the car, coming around to open my door like the gentleman he had always been. And I pushed down my feelings because I told myself that this wasn't the time, that we could talk about this later, that right now I needed to focus on making a good impression on his family, even though everything in my gut was screaming at me to ask him to take me home. We walked up to the front door, and I could feel my heart pounding so hard I thought it might actually break through my ribcage. Each step on the stone pathway feeling heavier than the last, like I was walking towards something I couldn't come back from, toward a moment that would define everything that came after. Daniel rang the doorbell, and I could hear it echo through the house. This deep, melodious sound that seemed to announce our arrival to everyone inside. The door opened, and there stood a woman who could only be his mother, dressed in what I would later learn was designer everything. From her perfectly tailored cream-colored suit to her tasteful pearl necklace, her blonde hair styled in that way that looks effortless, but probably took a professional stylist an hour to achieve. She looked at Daniel with genuine warmth, her face lighting up as she pulled him into a hug. But when her eyes shifted to me, something changed. Something I couldn't quite name but could definitely feel. Like the temperature in the air dropped several degrees in the space of a single second. "Mother, this is my girlfriend," Daniel said, and I noticed immediately that he didn't use my name, didn't give me that basic courtesy of a proper introduction, and I felt another small crack form in the foundation of my trust in him. "Hello, Mrs. Morrison," I said, extending my hand with what I hoped was a confident smile. My voice steady, even though inside I was trembling with nervousness and this growing sense that I had made a terrible mistake in coming here. She looked at my outstretched hand for a moment too long, just long enough to make it awkward, before finally shaking it with the tips of her fingers, the kind of handshake that communicates disdain and distance, like she was afraid my ordinary existence might somehow contaminate her perfect world. "How nice," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of false politeness that Southern women have perfected over generations, the kind that sounds sweet but cuts like a knife if you're paying attention to the subtext beneath the words. We stepped inside, and I was immediately overwhelmed by the interior of the house, by the marble floors and crystal chandeliers and artwork that looked like it belonged in a museum, rather than a private residence. Every surface seemed to gleam, every corner seemed designed to impress and intimidate in equal measure, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a showroom than a home where actual people lived and loved and made memories. Daniel's mother led us through a hallway lined with family portraits, and I couldn't help but notice that everyone in those pictures looked the same shade of pale skin, the same expensive clothes, the same practiced smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, like happiness was something performed rather than genuinely felt. We entered a formal dining room where the rest of the family was already gathered, and I could feel all of their eyes on me simultaneously, assessing, judging, categorizing me into whatever box they had already prepared for the kind of girl their son would bring home. Daniel's father was a tall, imposing man with gray hair and a stern expression that suggested he didn't smile often or easily, standing near the fireplace with a glass of what I assumed was expensive whiskey in his hand. His sister, who I later learned was named Caroline, was perched on the edge of a chair like a bird of prey, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my rent for several months. Her eyes sharp and calculating as they traveled up and down my body, taking in every detail of my appearance, and finding it lacking in ways she was already preparing to articulate. Her husband stood beside her, a man whose name I never bothered to remember because he barely spoke the entire evening, just nodded along with whatever his wife said like a puppet whose strings she controlled with expert precision. There was also Daniel's younger brother, Marcus, who at least had the decency to give me a genuine smile, though even his greeting felt muted, subdued, like he had been trained not to be too welcoming to outsiders who hadn't yet proven their worth to the family. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt like you didn't belong, like every molecule in your body was screaming that you were in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people? That's exactly how I felt standing in that dining room, surrounded by people who looked at me like I was in curiosity, an oddity, something to be examined and discussed, and ultimately dismissed. We all sat down at this enormous dining table that could have easily seated 20 people, and I found myself positioned directly across from Caroline, who I quickly realized was going to be my primary tormentor for the evening, with Daniel seated beside me but somehow feeling miles away, already retreating into himself in a way that made me feel utterly alone, despite being surrounded by people. The dinner started with appetizers brought out by a uniformed staff member, because of course they had staff, and the conversation began innocuously enough, with Daniel's father asking him about work and some deal he was working on, using terminology and references that flew completely over my head. I sat there quietly, eating my soup and trying to look engaged, trying to find an opening to join the conversation naturally without seeming pushy or desperate for attention. But it quickly became clear that no one was particularly interested in making me feel included or welcome in their family discussion. Then Caroline turned to me with this smile that didn't reach her eyes and asked, "So, what is it that you do?" in that tone that suggested she already knew the answer wouldn't be impressive enough for her standards. "I work as a consultant," I replied, keeping my answer vague as Daniel and I had discussed, and I could see the immediate dismissal in her expression, the way her lips pursed slightly like she had just tasted something unpleasant. "A consultant," she repeated, making the word sound somehow less than it was, like I had said I was unemployed or worked at a fast food restaurant, neither of which would have been shameful, but both of which clearly would have been unacceptable to her privileged worldview. "How interesting. And where did you study?" The questions came rapid-fire after that, each one designed to establish my place in the social hierarchy, to determine whether I was worthy of their son, their brother, their carefully curated family image. I answered honestly about my state university education, watching as they exchanged glances that communicated their disappointment more clearly than words ever could. I mentioned the neighborhood where I grew up, a working-class area that I had always been proud of, where people worked hard and looked out for each other and didn't judge someone's worth by the size of their bank account. But to them, it might as well have been a slum. Some dangerous place they had only heard about in cautionary tales about what happens when you don't work hard enough or marry well enough or play the social game with sufficient skill. The main course arrived, some elaborately prepared dish that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce, and the insults became less subtle, more direct, cutting through the thin veneer of politeness that had barely been maintained during the first course. Caroline commented on my dress, saying, "How quaint," in a way that made it clear she thought it was anything but, that she had probably identified it as off the rack from a mid-range department store, rather than some designer boutique where she shopped. Daniel's mother made a remark about my hair, suggesting that I might want to try a more refined style if I was going to be attending important events with Daniel, implying that my natural texture was somehow inappropriate or unprofessional. His father asked pointed questions about my family's background, my parents' professions, my lack of country club membership or connections to anyone they might know, each question revealing another way in which I failed to meet their standards for who their son should be dating. I sat there taking it all, every insult, every dismissive comment, every condescending look, feeling myself getting smaller and smaller with each passing moment, like I was physically shrinking under the weight of their judgment, and Daniel's continued silence. Because that was the worst part. Worse than all the insults combined, the fact that Daniel said nothing in my defense, didn't challenge a single one of their cruel comments, didn't stand up for me or tell them to back off or show even the slightest indication that he disagreed with their treatment of me. He just sat there eating his food, occasionally nodding along with their conversation, acting like I wasn't being systematically torn apart by the people he supposedly loved, like my pain and humiliation were acceptable casualties in his desire to maintain peace with his family. I kept looking at him, willing him to meet my eyes, to give me some sign that he recognized how awful this was, but he kept his gaze firmly on his plate, a coward hiding behind expensive china and crystal glasses. Caroline was relentless, continuing her assault throughout dinner with comments about my shoes, my jewelry, the way I held my fork, every tiny detail of my existence subject to her scrutiny and disapproval. She talked about the women Daniel had dated before, all of them from good families, with proper backgrounds and appropriate educations, making it abundantly clear that I was a significant downgrade from his previous girlfriends, a mistake he would hopefully correct once he came to his senses. His mother joined in, sharing stories about Daniel's ex-girlfriend Victoria, who apparently came from a family even wealthier than theirs, who had attended the right schools and knew the right people and fit seamlessly into their social circle in all the ways I clearly didn't. They spoke about Victoria with this wistful nostalgia, like she was the one who got away, the standard against which all future girlfriends would be measured and found wanting, and I had to sit there listening to them essentially tell me I would never be good enough for their son, while he said absolutely nothing to contradict them. The conversation shifted to charity work, to all the philanthropic boards Daniel's mother and sister served on, and they asked if I was involved in any charitable organizations, their tone suggesting they already knew the answer would be no, that someone like me probably didn't have time for such noble pursuits, too busy just trying to make ends meet to worry about helping others less fortunate. I thought about telling them about the volunteer work I actually did, about the mentorship program I had been part of for years, about the scholarship fund I had quietly established, but something stopped me, some instinct that told me this wasn't the moment, that revealing too much would somehow make things worse rather than better. So I simply said, I donate when I can, and watched as they exchanged those looks again, those silent communications that spoke volumes about their contempt for my inadequate answer. Dessert came and went. Some elaborate chocolate creation that I barely tasted because my throat was tight with unshed tears and suppressed anger, my stomach churning with a mixture of humiliation and growing rage. The insults continued, now expanding to include comments about my accent, which apparently wasn't refined enough, about my mannerisms, which were too casual for their standards, about my lack of knowledge regarding their world of country clubs and charity galas and summer homes in the Hamptons. They made jokes at my expense, laughing at references I didn't understand because they were about people and places I had no connection to, inside jokes from a social circle I would never be invited to join. Marcus, Daniel's younger brother, occasionally shot me apologetic looks, like he wanted to say something supportive, but didn't dare contradict his family's united front of disapproval. As coffee was served, I felt something shift inside me, some internal switch being flipped from hurt to fury, from victimhood to empowerment, because I suddenly realized that I didn't have to sit here and take this, that I wasn't the problem in this scenario, they were. Their cruelty, their snobbery, their complete lack of basic human decency towards someone who had done nothing wrong except fall in love with their son, that was the real issue here, not my background or my education or my net worth. I looked at Daniel one more time, giving him one final chance to prove me wrong, to show that he was the man I thought I had fallen in love with, but he just sat there, still avoiding my gaze, still choosing his family's approval over my dignity. And in that moment, I knew our relationship was over, that whatever we had built together over the past 6 months had been built on a foundation of lies and cowardice that could never support anything lasting or real. I took a deep breath, set down my coffee cup with deliberate care, and felt this calm settle over me, the kind of calm that comes right before a storm, when you know exactly what you need to do and you're ready to do it regardless of the consequences. Caroline was in the middle of another story about some charity event she had attended, name-dropping celebrities and politicians like they were her personal friends, when I interrupted her, my voice cutting through the conversation with a clarity and strength I didn't know I possessed in that moment. I have something to say, I announced, and the table fell silent, everyone turning to look at me with varying expressions of surprise and annoyance that I had dared to speak without being directly addressed. Daniel's hand reached for mine under the table, gripping it tightly, and I didn't know if he was trying to support me or silence me. But either way, I pulled my hand away from his, rejecting his touch after hours of sitting next to someone who felt like a stranger. I've sat here all evening listening to you insult me, mock me, belittle everything about who I am and where I come from, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. You've made it abundantly clear that you think I'm not good enough for Daniel, that I'm somehow less than you because I don't have your money or your connections or your precious pedigree. I could see Caroline's mouth opening to interrupt, but I held up my hand, and something in my expression must have stopped her because she actually stayed quiet for once. But here's what you don't know. What Daniel apparently didn't think was important enough to share with you because he was too busy being ashamed of dating someone from my background. I paused, letting the weight of that accusation sink in, watching Daniel's face go pale as he realized where this was going. My full name is not what Daniel told you. I use a different last name in my personal life for privacy reasons, because in my professional life, I'm actually quite well known in certain circles. I reached into my purse and pulled out my business card, the one I rarely used but always carried, the one with my full title and credentials printed in elegant script. I placed it on the table, sliding it toward the center where everyone could see it, and watched as Daniel's mother picked it up, her eyes widening as she read what was written there. I'm the CEO and founder of Bennett Consulting Group, I said, naming one of the most successful boutique consulting firms in the country, one that specialized in helping Fortune 500 companies navigate complex corporate restructuring, a firm that had been featured in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal multiple times over the past 5 years. Perhaps you've heard of it. We recently completed a successful turnaround for Morrison Industries, actually. Your company, if I'm not mistaken. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Daniel's father's sharp intake of breath as he reached for the business card his wife was now holding with trembling fingers. I watched the realization dawn on their faces, one by one, as they connected the dots. As they understood that the poor girl they had spent the entire evening mocking and belittling was actually someone who could probably buy their house with cash if she wanted to. Someone whose professional reputation and business acumen far exceeded anything they had accomplished in their privileged lives. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood because my parents believed in teaching me the value of hard work and humility. I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word. I went to a state university because I earned a full academic scholarship based on merit, not family connections. I worked 3 jobs while getting my MBA from Stanford, which I also attended on scholarship, graduating top of my class. Caroline's face had gone from smug superiority to shocked embarrassment, her perfectly made-up features frozen in an expression that would have been comical if the situation weren't so serious. I built my company from nothing, starting in a cramped apartment with just my laptop and my determination, working 18-hour days for years until I had established enough of a reputation to attract major clients. I now employ over 200 people. I sit on the boards of 3 major corporations, and yes, I do extensive charity work, though I prefer to do it quietly without the need for publicity or social recognition. I turned to look at Daniel, who couldn't meet my eyes, who looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. I never told you the full extent of my success because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I have or what I've accomplished. I wanted to be sure you were with me because you genuinely cared about me as a person, not because you saw me as a trophy or a business asset. But clearly I was wrong about you, I said, my voice breaking slightly on those words because despite my anger, despite everything, part of me had still hoped he would surprise me, would prove that there was more to him than the weak man I had seen tonight. You sat here all evening and let your family tear me apart. You didn't defend me once, didn't challenge a single insult, didn't show even the slightest backbone in standing up for the woman you claim to love. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Or rather, your lack of it. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the stunned silence. Mrs. Morrison. Thank you for dinner, even though the company left much to be desired. Mr. Morrison, I believe my firm sent you a final invoice last month for our services. I trust it will be paid promptly. I turned to Caroline, who was staring at me like I had just grown a second head. All her earlier smugness completely evaporated. And Caroline, that dress you're wearing? I have the same one hanging in my closet at home. I bought it last season at full price from the designer's boutique in Paris when I was there for a business meeting. It looks better on me. It was petty. I knew it was petty. But after everything they had put me through, I allowed myself that one small moment of satisfaction. I picked up my purse, straightened my shoulders, and prepared to walk out of that house with my head held high, ready to leave behind not just Daniel's horrible family, but Daniel himself, the man who had proven himself unworthy of my love or my respect. Wait! Daniel finally found his voice, standing up and reaching for me, but I stepped away from him, maintaining my distance. Please, let me explain. Let me drive you home. We need to talk about this. His eyes were pleading, desperate, but all I could see was the coward who had sat silently while I was humiliated, who had prioritized his family's approval over my basic human dignity. There's nothing to talk about, I said quietly, my anger giving way to a deep sadness about what could have been if only he had been a different kind of man. You made your choice tonight, Daniel. You chose them over me, over us, over everything we supposedly meant to each other. That choice showed me who you really are, and I don't want to be with someone who lacks the courage to stand up for what's right, who cares more about maintaining false peace than protecting the person they love. I walked toward the door, and I could hear the family behind me erupting into chaos, everyone talking at once, Daniel's mother demanding to know why he hadn't told them who I really was, his father berating him for being an idiot, Caroline unusually quiet for the first time all evening. Daniel followed me, still trying to explain, making excuses about not wanting to make me uncomfortable by bringing up my success, about trying to protect me from his family's judgment, but every word just made it worse, made it clearer that he had never truly seen me as an equal partner, had always viewed me through the lens of his family's prejudices, even as he pretended not to. I called a car service from my phone, refusing to accept a ride from him, and waited outside on that perfect lawn under that star-filled sky, breathing in the cool night air and feeling something like freedom washing over me despite the pain. The car arrived within minutes, and as I slid into the back seat and gave my address, I looked back at the mansion one final time, seeing Daniel standing in the doorway, his figure backlit by the chandelier's glow, looking lost and confused like he couldn't understand how the evening had gone so wrong. But I understood perfectly. I understood that sometimes love isn't enough, that sometimes the person you fall for isn't actually the person you thought they were, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from someone who doesn't value you the way you deserve to be valued. The driver pulled away, and I watched the mansion disappear in the rearview mirror, getting smaller and smaller until it was just another big house in a neighborhood full of big houses, none of them homes in the truest sense of the word. The days and weeks that followed were difficult in ways I hadn't expected, not because I missed Daniel, which I did despite everything, but because I had to confront uncomfortable truths about myself and the choices I had made. I had allowed myself to be diminished, had sat there for hours accepting abuse from people who didn't deserve my time or respect, had compromised my own sense of self-worth in service of a relationship that was fundamentally unequal. I had lowered myself, hidden who I was, pretended to be less than I was, all in the name of love. But what I learned that night is that real love never requires you to make yourself smaller, never demands that you hide your light or apologize for your success or accept mistreatment from anyone, regardless of their relationship to the person you're dating. Daniel tried to contact me countless times in the following weeks, sending text messages and emails that grew progressively more desperate, showing up at my office building until security had to escort him out, leaving voicemails where he cried and apologized and begged for another chance. He sent flowers, which I donated to a local hospital. He sent jewelry, which I returned. He even sent a handwritten letter that must have been 10 pages long, explaining all his fears and insecurities that had led to his silence that night. But none of it mattered. None of it could undo what he had allowed to happen. None of it could restore my trust in him or my faith that he was capable of being the partner I needed and deserved. Some things, once broken, cannot be repaired, and our relationship was one of those things, shattered beyond any hope of reconstruction. I heard through mutual acquaintances that his family had been mortified when they realized who I actually was, that his mother had tried to reach out to me through professional channels to apologize, but I ignored those attempts at reconciliation because I didn't need their apology, didn't need their validation or approval or belated acceptance. Their opinion of me had never been the problem. The problem was Daniel's weakness in the face of their judgment, his inability to be the kind of man who puts his partner first, regardless of external pressure or family expectations. I learned that Caroline had actually researched my company after that dinner, discovering that we were indeed highly successful and well-respected in our field, and apparently she had been quite impressed despite herself. But again, I didn't care, because impressing her had never been my goal, and her retroactive respect meant nothing after the way she had treated me. What that experience taught me, more than anything, was the importance of knowing your worth and refusing to accept anything less than you deserve, whether in relationships or in any other aspect of life. I had worked too hard, overcome too many obstacles, built too much to allow anyone to make me feel small or inadequate or less than. My success wasn't something to be hidden or downplayed or apologized for. It was something to be proud of, something I had earned through sacrifice and determination and countless hours of work when others were sleeping or playing or taking their privileged positions for granted. I realized that I had been complicit in my own diminishment by agreeing to hide parts of myself, by accepting Daniel's request to be vague about my professional life, by prioritizing his comfort over my own authenticity. The story spread through my professional network, as these things tend to do, and I was surprised by how many people reached out to share similar experiences, stories of being judged or underestimated or dismissed based on their backgrounds or appearances, only to prove their worth in spectacular fashion later. There was something universally relatable about the experience of being underestimated, about the satisfaction of proving wrong those who had written you off, about the moment when you finally stand up for yourself after accepting mistreatment for too long. Several young professionals told me that hearing my story had inspired them to be more open about their achievements, to stop downplaying their success in dating situations or social settings, to demand partners who celebrated their accomplishments rather than feeling threatened by them. I also received messages from people who had been in Daniel's position, people who admitted they had failed to stand up for their partners against family judgment, who had chosen the path of least resistance over doing what was right, and who deeply regretted those choices. Some had lost relationships they truly valued because of their cowardice, just as Daniel had lost me, and they wanted me to know they understood why I had walked away, that they didn't blame me for refusing to accept his apologies or give him another chance. Their messages were touching, evidence that people can learn and grow from their mistakes. But they also reinforced my decision because I didn't want to be the teacher in Daniel's journey toward becoming a better man. Didn't want to sacrifice more of my time and emotional energy, helping him develop the backbone he should have already possessed. Looking back now, several months after that disastrous dinner, I can see it as a turning point. Not just in my romantic life, but in my entire approach to how I present myself to the world. I made a decision to be more authentically myself in all situations, to stop code switching or hiding parts of my identity, to make others comfortable, to embrace the full scope of who I am without apology or qualification. I started being more upfront about my professional success when dating, mentioning my company and my role within the first few conversations, watching carefully to see how potential partners reacted to that information. The wrong men were intimidated or dismissive, seeing my success as a threat to their masculinity or a challenge to traditional gender roles they still clung to, and I quickly moved on from those situations without regret or second thoughts. But there were also good men, secure men, successful men in their own right, who were genuinely excited about my accomplishments, who asked thoughtful questions about my work, who saw my drive and ambition as attractive qualities rather than character flaws. I eventually started dating someone new, a man who owns his own business and understands the demands of entrepreneurship, who celebrates my wins as enthusiastically as his own, who would never in a million years let his family or anyone else disrespect me the way Daniel's family did. On our third date, I told him the whole story about Daniel and that terrible dinner, and instead of being uncomfortable or making excuses for Daniel's behavior, he said, "That guy was an idiot to lose you, and I'm grateful for his stupidity because it means I get to be here with you now." That's when I knew I had found someone worthy of my time and trust. The experience also changed how I approach my professional life, making me more vocal about mentorship and helping other women navigate the challenges of building successful careers while maintaining authentic personal lives. I started speaking at universities and professional conferences about the importance of not diminishing yourself to fit into spaces that weren't designed for you, about the power of walking away from situations and people who don't value your worth, about the necessity of surrounding yourself with people who lift you up rather than tear you down. My story resonated with audiences, particularly young women from working-class backgrounds who were trying to break into industries and social circles where they felt like perpetual outsiders, where their accents or their clothes or their lack of family connections marked them as different in ways that could be used against them. I've been asked many times if I regret how I handled that dinner, if I wish I had revealed my identity earlier to avoid the hours of insults, or if I think I was too harsh in my final confrontation with Daniel and his family. The answer is no. I don't regret a single thing, because that experience, as painful as it was in the moment, taught me lessons I needed to learn about self-respect and boundaries and the kind of partner I deserve. If I had revealed who I was at the beginning of the dinner, I never would have seen Daniel's true character, never would have witnessed his cowardice and weakness, never would have understood that he was not the man I thought I had fallen in love with. Sometimes the universe puts us through difficult situations not to break us, but to show us truths we need to see. And that dinner showed me the truth about Daniel in a way nothing else could have. As for whether I was too harsh, I think anyone who sits through hours of systematic verbal abuse and then gets criticized for finally standing up for themselves needs to seriously examine their priorities and values. I don't owe kindness to people who showed me none. I don't owe patience to a man who couldn't be bothered to defend me. I don't owe second chances to those who didn't value the first one. We teach people how to treat us by what we accept, and I decided that night that I would never again accept disrespect or allow anyone to make me feel less than I am, regardless of their social status or their relationship to someone I care about. That's not being harsh. That's being healthy. That's being someone who values themselves enough to demand basic human decency from the people in their life. I want you to understand something important. Something I wish someone had told me years ago when I was younger and less confident and more willing to accept poor treatment in exchange for love or acceptance or belonging. You are worthy exactly as you are, with your background and your history and your struggles and your triumphs. You don't need to hide parts of yourself to make others comfortable. You don't need to downplay your success to avoid intimidating potential partners. You don't need to accept abuse from anyone, ever, regardless of the justifications or excuses they offer. The right people, the people who deserve a place in your life, will celebrate everything about you, will defend you fiercely, will stand beside you against any criticism or judgment from family or friends or society at large. If you find yourself in a situation like I was, Sitting somewhere feeling small and diminished while people insult you and the person who claims to love you says nothing. I want you to know that you have the power to walk away, that you should walk away, that staying in that situation does not make you noble or patient or loving. It makes you someone who is accepting less than you deserve. Love should never require you to endure mistreatment, should never demand that you sit silently while you're being torn apart, should never leave you feeling alone in a room full of people. Real love protects, real love defends, real love shows up when it matters most, and anything less than that is not worth your time or your heart or your precious energy. Have you ever been through something similar? Have you ever had to choose between love and self-respect? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below, because I think these experiences, as painful as they are, connect us in important ways, remind us that we're not alone in our struggles or our triumphs. If this story resonated with you, if you felt anything at all while listening to my experience, please hit that like button to let me know, because your engagement helps me understand what content matters most to you and encourages me to keep sharing these deeply personal stories. And if you're new here to my Truth Revealed Tales, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to this channel, because we share stories like this regularly, stories about real people facing real challenges and finding their strength and their voice, stories that remind us all of our inherent worth and dignity. Make sure to hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future stories, because trust me, we have some incredible tales coming up that I think you're going to love. Thank you for being here, for listening, for being part of this community where we lift each other up and remind each other that we deserve nothing less than respect, dignity, and genuine love. Until next time, remember your worth, stand in your power, and never let anyone make you feel small.